The following is an audio transcription of Lieutenant Final Report of Incident 19-343. The Piridian Massacre. Incident date December 15, 1990. Main interviewee is Miss. Security clearance level is strictly confidential. Physical copies of the transcription are to be destroyed immediately. Audio transcription is to be stored on tertiary database servers in the police department.
Arthur Piridian had, at one time, been a name attached to absolutely nothing in particular. Content in a life of average means, Arthur's 40 years of life had been modestly mundane. By all accounts, this ordinary life was exactly the way Arthur had intended for it to be. To this day, there has never been a clear motive for his actions on a brutally chilled December morning. I had the unfortunate privilege of talking about that day with the only survivor of Arthur Piridian's rampage, whose name I am legally obligated to keep secret. During the subsequent interviews in her mobile trailer, she asked that I refer to her as Rachel. Rachel had been fast asleep when Arthur Piridian started his rampage. Shortly after he began, something pierced through the wall that separated Rachel from her neighbor, through Rachel's bedroom wall, and finally through her bedroom window, creating a tiny hole in the glass. Investigators initially concluded that it was a bullet that had torn through the walls and window, but no bullet was ever recovered. That tiny hole ended up saving Rachel's life. "I was so confused at first," she said. "I couldn't stop looking through that hole in the window. How did it get there? Was it there before I went to sleep?" As these questions were scrolling through my mind, my other senses started to pick things up. I realized, all too suddenly, that it wasn't just the wind that I was hearing. There was a dreadful sound coming from the hallway, a horrific mix of loud banging and screaming. Not yelling, do you understand? This wasn't people shouting, this was screaming on an almost inhuman level. Rachel tried to convince herself she had left the kettle boiling on the stove, that the high-pitched screaming was the steam and pressure being released. It didn't take her long to realize that what she was actually hearing was the long, drawn-out shrieking of a woman. At the time, Rachel couldn't have known that the screaming belonged to Angela, the sweet older lady who was always first to leave in the morning for her daily walk on the treadmill. "She was always very kind to me," Rachel explained, a solitary tear brimming on the corner of her eyelid. Arthur systematically went apartment to apartment. After he killed Angela, he moved across the hall to the apartment of the Jones family. Rachel's was to be next. "If that tiny hole hadn't appeared in my window," she said, "I wouldn't be here today. I know this is a fact. I would have been sleeping through it until Arthur came into my room and killed me like he did everyone else." It's a sobering thought, and one that has kept Rachel up for almost every night for 25 years. I went through the standard stages of survivor's guilt. You know, why me and all those sorts of questions. Therapy, medication, group counseling, all those things helped in their own special way, but nothing has ever been able to drown out the screams of Angela, or the Joneses, or anybody else on our floor that morning. That hole, once thought to be caused by a bullet, was actually caused by something far more disturbing. About a month after the massacre, Detective Adams came to my door and told me what had happened. He was off duty. I remember that. I think, given how little they were actually able to figure out that morning, that he wanted to personally deliver some semblance of closure. I could see that Rachel was having trouble telling me what it was. She reached for a tall tumbler of whiskey. It was dark, aged, and the aroma was rippling through the air, causing my head to swim. After she drowned about 2 fingers worth, she looked up at me. It was a tooth. A forensic officer canvassing the surrounding area found it embedded in a tree 50 yards from my window. What could do that? What kind of force could cause a tooth to rip through 2 walls, break a window, and embed itself in a tree? Did she ever find out who the tooth belonged to? Rachel finished the rest of her glass with a strong chug, rearing her head to her back. With a grimace, she said, "Yeah, I didn't want to know, but I figured it out. It was Angela's." The investigative report chronicles the Joneses' last minutes of life in grisly but vague details. Both Adam and Mary Jones were killed in their beds in the master bedroom, as were their 2 children, John and Lucy, who shared a room down the hall. It's unclear which room Arthur entered first, but neither the children or the parents had time to even get out from underneath their blankets. In the report, the first officer on scene described the bedrooms as a bloodbath. In a later interview, he offered up this disturbing comparison. Have you ever made a raspberry smoothie in a blender and the top suddenly popped off? That's what those bedrooms looked like. Like someone had taken the top off a blender and strewn the Joneses all over the floors, walls, and ceiling. I wish I'd never stepped foot into that apartment. How Arthur was able to achieve such carnage is one of the long surrounding mysteries of the case. No weapon was ever found. Arthur's body revealed very little, and that there was barely any scratches on his hands or feet, despite the fact that he was covered, literally from head to toe, in the gore of 15 people, that there were no signs of physical trauma on any part of Arthur's body. The only noteworthy thing about Arthur's clothing was a small tear on the back of his shirt, right in the middle where his spine would be. The cause of this tear was never followed up on, and both Detective Adams and Detective Ponce dismissed the notion that there was any significance. Just as Arthur Piridian was entering the Joneses' apartment, Rachel was beginning to fully grasp how much danger she was in. You have to understand this was before everybody had a cell phone, before everyone was always connected to the internet. The power had been out in my apartment, so I couldn't use the landline. Ours was on the top floor, so it wasn't like I could just jump out the window. What about the fire escape just outside her bedroom window? See, you're asking rational questions for an irrational situation. Of course, that's what I should have done, gone out the fire escape. But maybe if I had, I wouldn't be here talking to you. I wouldn't have seen what I saw. But that's not the way things work. I wasn't thinking rationally. I was thinking that I had to stop it, whatever it was, from happening. I've always been like that. In 1993, Rachel had just finished her first year of the service as a police officer. At the top of her graduating class, Rachel was making a name for herself by always being the first one in and the last one out. During her first week as an officer, she single-handedly took down a 300-pound biker who was on top of his wife, choking the life out of her. The following week, she disobeyed a direct order by refusing to wait for backup, entering a rundown building on her own in an effort to save a kidnapped victim. Her fellow officers started calling her No Fear, a popular clothing brand at the time. I loved it, she said, offering up her first smile since we'd met. I was lucky in the fact that I was never really considered a girl or a female officer by my male colleagues. Those first 2 weeks saw to that. When Rachel started to realize that something truly awful was happening around her, the thought of escaping never crossed her mind. It's really interesting how memories work. I could probably name only 1 or 2 people that were killed that day, but I very clearly remember that the hallway light was flickering when I opened my front door. It was making that little hum, you know? That buzz that fluorescent bulbs make. It was struggling so hard to keep alight, but the fight was futile. The power was out and the backup system was not functioning. I was swallowed in the darkness. When Rachel opened up her door to the main hallway, Arthur Piridian was in the room across from hers. I didn't know what was happening. I had no notion that Arthur was across the hall, doing what he was doing. My first and only thought was checking on Angela. Dressed in a shirt that was 2 sizes too big and her favorite pair of rundown blue jeans, Rachel walked out into the hall and noticed something strange. All of the doors were open. I mean, all of them. I had a powerful flashlight on hand, and the beam caught every gap between the door and the hallway, but they weren't wide enough open that I could see into each unit. They were only slightly ajar, like somebody had unlocked every door on the floor. While there has long been a belief among amateur investigators that Arthur didn't act alone that night, Detective Ponce said that theory was quickly quashed early into the investigation. We looked into that possibility, he told me. The sheer amount of work, so to speak, that was carried out that morning would make anyone think that Arthur had help. I can assure you, however, that there has never been any doubt in my mind that Arthur, and only Arthur, was the orchestrator of that massacre. Never a single shred of doubt in my mind. When I pressed him for proof about this, he shut me down pretty quick. I can't talk about it, was all he was able to say. While the other doors offered only a slight glimpse into each unit, Rachel saw straight away that Angela's door had been almost completely torn off the hinges. It was hanging off the top hinge, so the bottom corner of the door was jutting out into the wall behind it. Rachel cautiously but confidently entered Angela's unit, realizing too late that she had left her service revolver in the nightstand beside her bed. There was the persistent voice in the back of my head that told me to keep moving. Maybe it was my training as a police officer. Maybe it was something else, I don't know. All I know is that if I had gone back for my gun at that moment when I realized I didn't have it, well, I would have run straight into Arthur. Arthur had finished with the Joneses and gone straight towards Rachel's unit. Obviously, I didn't know what he was doing. The detectives filled me in on his movements long after that. At the time that Arthur was supposedly in my bedroom, I was in Angela's, too scared to move, or to even breathe, to do anything. During her training as a police officer, Rachel had seen her fair share of death. Pictures, videos, reports. Once you read your 13th autopsy report, you start to become numb to the violence and the gore. They always told us to try to not think of them as people, but rather as evidence. What is this body trying to tell you? Even when I saw my first real corpse in the field, I wasn't fazed. That reaction helped spur my reputation, and so I reveled in it. So what was Angela's body trying to tell me? To run away. To run far away and never ever look behind me. The coroner for the autopsies, Daniel, concluded that Angela and the 16 others who had died due to severe blood loss and trauma. During my interview with Daniel, he stated that he wrote that only because he had very little to work with. I couldn't perform an autopsy in the traditional sense, he told me. If there wasn't an actual body, there's only so much I can do. Rachel was standing in Angela's bedroom, frozen to the spot. I'd never seen anything like it. I'd never even heard about anything like it. I was trained to handle violence and death, but this was beyond me. Beyond anyone. About a year ago, there was a rumor that the crime scene photos had leaked onto the web. Despite the warnings of my therapist, I checked them out. But I couldn't help but laugh when I saw them. They were obviously fake. Some Piridian fanatic who'd taken it upon themselves to recreate what they think happened. The image itself was pretty horrific, but fake. Absolutely fake. I can honestly say that not even the most twisted mind could come up with what Angela's bedroom looked like. Have you ever seen the supposed photos of a Jack the Ripper victim? What remained of Angela looked like Jack the Ripper had ingested 20 doses of PCP and had been hyped up on steroids, and had talons for fingers. If I hadn't heard Angela scream, if I hadn't have known that I was standing in her bedroom, there would have been no way to identify her remains. The timeline indicates that Arthur didn't remain in Rachel's apartment for long, perhaps because it only took seconds to realize she wasn't there. He didn't come looking for me, she said, taking a long drag off of a stained cigarette. He knew who I was. We'd chatted in the hall a few times, small talk mostly. He was quiet, reserved, but gentle and kind. Your classic introvert. He regularly brought groceries in for Angela, despite her protests. I think she reminded him of his older sister who died a long time ago. Nobody could have predicted what was bubbling beneath the surface. Why then didn't he come looking for her? You'd have to ask him that. Arthur's systematic approach to the killings could perhaps reveal something about his state of mind during the massacre. He quickly moved on to the next unit across the hall, the Joneses' neighbor Adam Carroll. Detective Adams seemed particularly angry about what happened to Adam Carroll, and she told me because it was of the quiet brutality of his death. Carroll was one of only 2 bodies that were found relatively intact. We know Adam Carroll was eating cereal at his kitchen table with his back to the door that led out to the hall. That's what he was doing. Eating cereal, listening to music. His headphones had been crushed into his head. The bowl beneath his torn apart jaw was full of his own brain. Parts of his skull were sitting on the spoon, which he was still holding when we found him. The first thing I thought of when I saw Adam was that somebody had smashed a watermelon over his head. To this day, I can't touch a bowl of cereal, and I sure as hell am never going to eat a watermelon. When Arthur entered Adam's unit, Rachel was finally able to move from her spot in Angela's bedroom. There was nothing I could do for Angela. That much was obvious. When I heard another inhuman scream, it was like I'd been pushed into an ice bath. My training took over. I knew that getting help was my first priority. That inhuman scream most likely came from the mouth of Adam Carroll before it was ripped off. The first thing Rachel tried was to open Angela's bedroom window to get to the fire escape. I've always had a strong stomach. I couldn't remember the last time I felt nauseous before I went into that bedroom. But that window, my God, that window. It was like Angela's insides had fused to it. I remember the bile bubbling up from my stomach as I tried to wipe away the bloody pulp. But when I tried to lift the window, it was stuck, wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I tried, that window was not gonna move. I tried to break it, I did. I picked up Angela's bedside table and threw it as hard as I could against that window. Nothing. The thick layer of gore had caked onto the glass, and it was impossibly tough. This was my only access to the fire escape in that unit, but there was another smaller window in the kitchen. I thought maybe I could stick my head out and get someone's attention, but not only was it the early morning and no one was outside, we were on the top floor. The wind whipped around my head so hard that my shouting was suffocated by the whirling air. And the power was still out, so the phone was useless. I had no other choice. I had to go back out into the hallway. As Rachel was trying everything she could to help, Arthur had moved across the hall into Rachel's other neighboring unit, the Maxwells. Thomas Maxwell was a single father to his daughter Gloria, and he was in the shower getting ready for work when Arthur came inside. This would be the turning point during that morning, where Arthur's quiet killing spree turned into a chaotic rampage. 3 minutes after Arthur entered the Maxwell's unit, police operators received the first emergency call from the building's address. And it wouldn't be the last. During this part of the interview, I could see that Rachel was struggling. My first thought should have been about the Maxwells. Gloria was the only kid on the floor, a precious 8-year-old. She would often knock on my door and ask me about my day, begging me to tell her about all the bad guys that I'd put away. And Thomas, he was a wonderful father, but he worked long shifts. At first, he hired a babysitter for Gloria, but over the years we all became her surrogate nannies. She was a beautiful person on the inside and out. Arthur wanted to see if that was really true. I asked Rachel if that's when all hell broke loose, as some of the other tenants on the surrounding floors described it. What followed was one of the few times I've ever seen the color drain away from somebody's face. "Don't say that," she whispered frenetically, as she bolted out of her chair to fasten the deadbolts on the inside of her door. There were 4 of them. How could I have known? It was the middle of the week. Who has a sleepover in the middle of the week, on a school night? It was only then that Rachel had asked to take a break. I looked at my watch. We'd been talking for 4 hours. People in the building described Thomas Maxwell as a gentle giant, a teddy bear of gargantuan proportions. Officially listed as 6'5" and weighing almost 240 pounds of blue-collar muscle, Thomas had been a star football player during his college years. He married his high school sweetheart, who followed him into college, and before cancer took her away, she had 3 amazing years with her Gloria and her Thomas. When officers found Thomas on the bedroom floor, there was very little of the former football player. Ground beef was the term that flowed through the officers on the scene, and despite its crude nature, it best described what remained of Thomas Maxwell. How meager Arthur Piridian, listed as 5'9" and 170 pounds soaking wet, was able to cause such massive trauma may never be known. All that is known of the death of Thomas Maxwell was the last, quiet death of that morning, though even that fact is disputable. The first few calls that operators received shared a common description, that some sort of wild animal was attacking people in the building. Speaking to one of the operators, who wished to remain anonymous, further solidifies these claims. There were about 4 consecutive calls in just as many seconds, all coming from the same address, and all describing the same thing, more or less. I didn't take the first or second call. I was in charge that morning, responsible for managing all the operators during the shift. After the second call reporting some kind of animal attack on the top floor, my first thought was that it was an elaborate, group-organized prank. You'd be surprised how many of those we get daily. I was going to report them when I took the third call, and then I heard it. I know why they thought it was an animal. Those sounds were not human. When Rachel came out of her bedroom at the back of the trailer, I asked her about Thomas. A second smile appeared on her face, but only for a second. He was such a kind man. You felt safe around him. Angela in particular was crazy about him. Not in a romantic way, she was 40 years older than him, but in a I wish I had a son like you kind of way. Angela was never able to have any children, and never told me why. Her smile was gone, but Rachel and I knew what had to come next. Gloria Maxwell wasn't just popular on the floor of her apartment building. She was popular everywhere. A rare combination of intelligent and kind. Anybody who met her fell in love with her on the spot. There had been a group project assigned at her school the week before, and Gloria had offered her apartment as the meeting place. The parents of Gloria's friends all confirmed this is the reason why there were 6 people in the Maxwell's unit that morning, as not the usual 2. I never went in after Arthur had been in there. I never got the chance. There were too many other things happening. I didn't have the time to process it all. Despite her best intentions, we both know the truth. Rachel didn't need to go into the Maxwells. She'd heard Angela's, and she'd been in Angela's bedroom. I didn't need to see what happened. I heard what happened. And in some ways, that's kind of worse. When I told her of the police reports about a wild animal, she offered me a glancing smirk. I'm not surprised. The nearest police precinct to Rachel's building was approximately 7 minutes away, according to Police Chief Dallas. On that December morning, traffic was light, and officers were able to reach Rachel's apartment building in exactly 6 minutes after the third distress call, the one that convinced the operator that this was not a prank. In 6 minutes, Arthur Piridian killed 11 people, including himself. That's almost 2 every minute. The speed and ferocious efficiency with which Arthur was able to carry out his rampage was practically unheard of. Before I interviewed Rachel, I managed to track down the 2 officers who'd entered the Maxwell unit. Though I'm not allowed to reveal their names, I can reveal that they had both retired a year after the Piridian Massacre. They were both 35 years old. Officially, their reason for early retirement is health-related, but everybody really knows why. Detective Adams, during one of her quieter moments, said, "Those 2 officers are the bravest people I know. If I'd been them, entering the Maxwell unit armed with only a flashlight and a small handgun, and saw what I saw, I would have retired the next day. Ponce and I were ready for it. We'd seen the pictures before we went inside. Our captain insisted on it. I'll never forget what he said. 'I won't hold it against you if you don't want to go in there.' And this was a man who once berated me for not ironing my pants before a shift. He was the epitome of order and rule following. It was our job to go inside that unit, and here was my captain telling me it was okay if I didn't want to, and I'll always love him for that." When asked if the 4 young girls, including Gloria, suffered similar fates to that of Angela, Adam, and Thomas, Detective Ponce offered me this. "I'm convinced that now, after everything that's happened, after seeing all the crap that I've seen, after knowing all the things that I know, that there's some things that no one should ever know, that there are some things no one should ever see. Did you hear the rumor that some of the crime scene photos had leaked online? I never even took my feet off my desk. I knew that wasn't possible. After Captain Davis showed us the only photos ever taken inside that unit, he grabbed my arm as I left to go outside and whispered, 'Burn them,' in my ear. When I got back outside from the Maxwell unit, the captain and I had ourselves a nice big fire. It was December. In the north, it gets real cold when the night falls down on us." In the trailer, Rachel moved toward me, shifting her chair slightly so that our eyes were but a whisper apart. "The first time I saw Arthur, he'd finished with the Maxwells. That hallway should have been darker, but there was the faintest hint of sunlight streaming in as the day began. Still, we were just shadows." Too frightened to reach for her flashlight, Rachel's only true glimpse of Arthur felt alien. "You know, a long time ago, I was in Australia, surfing a quiet spot along the east coast. Those who surf know about the quiet periods, the calm that comes between the swells. There were days when the waves barely reached our knee, but you still sat on top of the deep, legs hanging in the water, content with the knowledge that the wave may not come today or tomorrow, but it will always come. On that day in Australia, in a quiet little beach tucked away between the Apostle Rocks, I was sitting on my board during a calm swell, and I saw it. A shadow drifting beneath me. It was something ancient, a predator, unchanged for millions of years. All too suddenly, I was aware of just how small I was, how easily I could slip below the surface, and only a single ripple would break. That's how I felt when I saw Arthur, or whatever was wearing Arthur." After the Maxwells, Arthur would slip in and out of 3 more units, killing 4 people in just as many. They were Sandy, a musician who'd only arrived home an hour earlier after playing at a local pub; Kate and Jamal, a boyfriend and girlfriend sleeping on the couch with their television still on; and Marcus, a university student preparing for his last exam. Each victim's family required dental records to formally identify the dead. The first officer to find Arthur Piridian was Rachel, who had escaped down the main stairway after her fleeting moment with him in the dark. The moment that police car drove into the main parking lot, I knew I had to get back up there. This was the kind of situation that I had trained for, the very reason that I was put on this earth. My adrenaline shot up. I ran back up the stairs and practically crashed into that hallway. The sun had almost risen, so I could see everything a lot clearer. Every door had been almost destroyed. A bloody trail of awfulness I can't even imagine led all the way to the other side of the hall. I didn't need my flashlight to know who was sitting against the wall. Arthur Piridian was dead, propped up like a ventriloquist dummy. That glassy-eyed expression etched into his blood-covered face. Those people all over his fingers. The following day, a meeting was convened, involving the police captain, the mayor, the immediate families of the victims, and the 2 editors of a local press outlet. A unanimous decision was made to never, ever disclose the nature of the case to anyone outside the town. None of the first responders needed to be told twice. All those involved directly or indirectly with the case would silently and collectively agree that, as Detective Ponce told me, there are some things we should never know. Other than how Arthur Piridian managed to ruthlessly dismantle 17 people in less than 10 minutes, the biggest question that remains is why? Why would Arthur Piridian, a seemingly normal man to anyone who ever met him, commit such atrocities? But when I asked Detective Adams why this case was considered unsolved, she told me this. Because we don't know. We don't know anything. I mean, we know who killed those people. That much was never in doubt. Ponce and I disagree on a crap ton of stuff, but he and I agree on this. Arthur Piridian acted alone that morning. Normally, a detective's main job is to find the who. That part was solved as soon as we walked in that building. But we didn't know how he did it. How could someone so average in every possible way tear people apart like that? At our lowest moment, when even the straws were out of our grasp, we toyed around with the possibility that maybe Arthur really did have some kind of animal with him. After a few whiskeys, Ponce and I came up with this elaborate scenario where Arthur, leading an introverted life, managed to raise a bear cub into a full-grown monster, and only then, with this bear fully grown under his control, would he unleash it upon the inhabitants of the building. I started to laugh, but the detective was quick to cut me off. Hey, don't make the same mistake I did. When I woke up the next morning, I felt sick to my stomach, and not because of the whiskey. I was sick with fear. Because the idea that Arthur had managed to raise a bear into a killing machine, and it was now loose upon the world, was the least frightening theory that I had. How was Arthur Piridian able to gain access to every unit? Detective Adams just shook her head. There was zero indication that anybody other than the tenants themselves opened the doors to their home. At some point before the morning began, at least one person in each unit got up and simply unlocked their door. What kind of behavior is that? We tested both the blood of all the victims and the air samples collected from each room. No drugs, no contaminants. The only thing you could hang a hand on was that the air samples came back inconclusive. But we can't do much with that. What about Arthur's past life? Did his apartment reveal anything? For me, that's the scariest thing about this whole mess, Detective Ponce concluded. There was nothing in his apartment. I don't mean to say that we didn't find anything that offered up a clue. No. I mean we didn't find anything. Not a single damn thing was in that apartment. No clothing, no pictures, no books, no food, no nothing. There wasn't even any water in the toilet. This was just the beginning of Detective Ponce's descent into the Arthur rabbit hole. No one at work knew anything about him, beyond that he was a creature of habit. He always showed up on time, always completed the projects that were given to him, and always ate lunch at his desk. The most descriptive words that I got out of any of his coworkers were friendly. He was always making notes in meetings, and his boss barely had any interaction with him, other than the occasional "good work, Arthur," when he handed his report in. He wasn't offensive, and I don't think anybody ever gave him a second thought. Ponce's investigation into Arthur only became stranger the further back he dug. I went as far back as his primary school teachers, at least the ones that were, still alive. His parents are dead, and he was an only child, so I figured maybe his teachers would know the most about him. I talked to 5 primary school teachers, 6 secondary, and 12 high school teachers. They all said the exact same thing. Arthur was Arthur. None of them could tell me a single thing about him, and I had to show a picture of him to most of them before they could even remember him. The strangest thing was that they all remembered not remembering him. He was just there. As I packed up to leave, Rachel grabbed my hand and looked at me with the wild eyes of somebody who had seen through the darkness. "You're not going to tell anyone, are you? The judge was very clear." This is strictly information to those given access, a database of what happened. I assured her that any information I revealed publicly would reveal no names, and no location would be given out. She stood there for a minute, and then let go of my hand. The last thing she said to me was this: "We destroyed it, you know?" After that morning, the place was condemned. 156 people had to leave their homes within a week, but no one complained. And then we packed it full of explosives and demolished it to the ground. No part of that building remains. Arthur Piridian and the people he killed only live on paper now. I wished her happiness and left. I didn't have the heart to tell her that I'd been there, that I'd seen where the building once stood. Nothing grows there. Only ash remains. The dust of the dead.